Philip. The power to tax was a critically important element of the framers' constitutional strategy. As Alexander Hamilton pointed out in 1750, without certain revenues, a government can have no power. That power, which holds the purse strings, absolutely must rule. Taxation provided. The power to tax was a critically important element of the framers' constitutional strategy. As Alexander Hamilton pointed out in 1750, without certain revenues, a government can have no power. That power, which holds the purse strings, absolutely must rule. Taxation provided the necessary revenue to repay the debt, establish a public credit system, and issue a new currency that would provide the capital to set up, run.
Where?
Power to tax was a critically important element of the framers' constitutional strategy. The power to tax was a critically important element of the framers' constitutional strategy. As Alexander Hamilton pointed out in 1750, without certain revenues, a government can have no power. That power, which holds the purse strings, absolutely must rule. Taxation provided the necessary revenue to repay the debt, establish a public credit system, and issue a new currency that would provide the capital to set up, run.
Okay, now we're back in business. Now we're back in business, yes. Just in a different room. Back in business, just in a different and colder room. Okay. Primarily, okay. Collected by taxing exports from other states. That all changed. When Massachusetts imposed draconian used to pay its requisition to Congress and repay creditors, sparking the Shades Rebellion. These taxes were immediately denounced as a betrayal of the revolution, by putting the population back under aristocracy and into slavery. Despite the obvious hypocrisy. I also wanted to share my screen. Wow, goes on to forever. Half a million actual people held in bondage as slaves. The majority of common people, many of whom were the original creditors, having had taken IOUs in exchange for their goods and services. Were now expected to suffer a second time. Their taxes were being used to repay. Speculators the face value is with interest of war debts. They bought on CD. And steep discounts. Taxes also sparked the elite. It's counter-revolution. Congress directed the states to assess the value of their land. So it could calculate their share of the revenue. However, these requisitions proved to be both extremely difficult to estimate and unpopular to collect. The states had discretion to collect. Taxes in any way they could. Resulting in taxes on land, people, or Poll tax, exports, imports, slaves, and other things of value. The revolution ended. Most states paid a steadily declining share. Of their requisitions, or none at all. While some were paying most or all. Some were most or all their debts, unable to pay in its bills into default. France in 1785. Congress and a number of states began reissuing paper money. Paper money relieved the coin shortage. Expanded the currency supply, and could be used to pay state taxes. Which were used to retire outstanding debts. Pennsylvania state legislature even passed a law in 1780 refusing repay a debt at face value. Because it would amount to paying the debt twice. While farmers demanded paper money, so that they could borrow from state land banks. Such plans did not reappear. Except in Pennsylvania, because not all the currencies declined. Paper money was not automatically. Inflationary, as is commonly claimed. Paper money lost value where merchants refused. To accept it as legal services. The value of paper money remained stable in some states, such as Pennsylvania. Because Congress lacked the power to tax directly, Several efforts were made to give it the power to impose tariffs on imports, which failed in 1781 and again narrowly in 1783 when New York approved it with conditions which were rejected by Congress. Its defeat, according to historian Jackson Turner Maine, was due to opposition by those who feared a consolidation of power in the central government. Giving Congress the power to tax land, slaves, income, and wealth was seen as a form of tyranny leading to standing armies, emoluments for the rich, destruction of the states, and expensive wars. Oh my god, it wasn't even recording. Because Congress lacked the power to tax directly, several efforts were made to give it the power to impose tariffs on imports, which failed in 1781 and again narrowly in 1783 when tax when New York approved it with conditions which were rejected by Congress. Its defeat, according to historian Jackson Turner Maine, was due to opposition by those who feared a consolidation of power in the central government. Giving Congress the power to tax land, slaves, income, and wealth was seen as a form of tyranny leading to standing armies, emoluments for the rich, destruction of the states, and expensive wars. Ironically, New York was one of the few states that paid its requisition in full during the Confederation. It did that by taxing most imports, a power it would not easily let go. Virginia and a few other states were also able to repay their debts by a combination of tax revenue and paper money. The ongoing negotiations to solve the problem of internal tariffs also disproved nationalists' claims that the Confederation had failed and needed to be replaced. New York proposed no longer taxing goods for re export if they remained packed. New Jersey and Pennsylvania agreed to concurrent jurisdiction over Delaware River traffic, as did Virginia and Maryland over the Potomac and Chesapeake Bay. These efforts weakened one of the major arguments for a new constitution. The struggle over taxation led the framers to design a constitution which empowered the elites to govern by making the economic majority pay for it. Limiting revenue to direct taxes, such as the tariff, was a minority check built into the Constitution by imposing a limitation on the power of majorities to decide how to tax. Direct taxes shielded elites from the burden while passing it on to the consumer in higher prices. Joined at the hip, slavery and taxes. Oh no. The relationship between the tariff and slavery did not begin at the convention. The, d- the debate over how to apportion the states' tax burden led to the passage of a real estate apportionment clause in 1777. This article this became Article 11, allowing government funds to be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several colonies in proportion to the number of inhabitants of every age, sex, and quality, except Indians not paying taxes in each colony, a true account of which distinguishing the white inhabitants. The words "who are not slaves" following the second use of the word "inhabitants" was removed and replaced with the modifier "white" to make it clear that slaves would not be counted in the system of taxation. Despite this language, the states disagreed about whether to count the value of slaves. The southern states preferred assessing a real estate value, as long as their slaves were not included, because their lands were less valuable than in the north. Northern delegates wouldn't go along with it for obvious reasons. Rather than tax property or heads, i.e., a poll tax, it adopted what became Article 7 in 1781, so that each colony may assess or lay such imposts or duties as it thinks proper. No federal impost was ever implemented, and states were unable to assess the value of property or impose a poll tax, relying instead on a combination of assorted taxes, paper money, and tariffs to meet their requisitions from Congress. Apportionment was the device for preventing a national tax on the population, while instead favoring one on foreigners. As Einhorn noted, Congress could levy the impost without talking about slavery. The Nationalists' project gained momentum once they got to Philadelphia. The power to tax was extended to Congress in 1.8.1, which reads the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, imposts, and excises to pay the debts. It is further limited by forbidding to Congress no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration herein before directed to be taken. 1.9.4. These clauses transferred the power to tax exclusively from the states to Congress. Over the next century, a system of dual jurisdiction over taxation emerged in which state and local governments taxed houses and land, while the federal government was effectively limited to the impost on specific imports rather than all imports. Okay. Sheesh. Okay, because Congress lacked the power to tax directly, several efforts were made to give it. Give it the power to impose tariffs on imports. To impose tariffs on imports. Which failed in 1781 and again narrowed it in 1783 when New York approved it with conditions. Which were rejected by Congress. Its defeat action to remain was due to opposition by those who feared a consolidation of power in the central government. Giving Congress the power to tax land, slaves, tax land, slaves, income, and wealth was seen as a form of tyranny, leading to standing armies, leading to standing armies, emoluments for the rich, destruction of the states, and expensive wars. Ironically, New York was one of the few states that paid its requisition in full during the Confederation. It did that by taxing most imports. A power it would not easily let go. Virginia and a few other states were able to repay their debts by a combination of tax revenue, and paper money. The ongoing negotiations were to solve the problem in turn. Also to disprove nationalists' claims that the Confederation had failed and needed to be replaced. New York proposed no longer taxing goods. For re-export if they remained packed. New Jersey and Pennsylvania agreed to concurrent jurisdiction over Delaware River traffic, as did Virginia and Maryland. Potomac, Chesapeake Bay. These efforts weakened one of the major arguments for a new constitution. The struggle over taxation led the framers to design a constitution which empowered the elites to govern by making the economic majority pay for it, limiting revenue to direct taxes such as the tariff was a minority check built into the Constitution. By imposing a limitation on the power of majorities to tax. Taxes. shielded elites from the burden. The burden joined at the hip. Slavery and taxes. The relationship between tariff and slavery did not begin at the Confederation. Debate over how to apportion the state's tax burden. Led to the passage of a real estate apportionment clause in 1777. This became Article 11. Oh, it's better. Article 11. Allowing government funds to be defrayed out of a common treasury, which shall be supplied by the several colonies in proportion to the number of inhabitants of every age, sex, and quality, except Indians. Indians not paying. Not paying taxes in each colony. A true account of which, distinguishing the white inhabitants. The words "who are not slaves" following the second use of the word was removed and replaced with the modifier white to make it clear that slaves would not be counted in the system of taxation. Despite this language, the states disagreed about whether to count the value of slaves. The southern states preferred assessing real estate values as long as their slaves were not included. their lands. Assessing. Northern delegates wouldn't go along with it. For obvious reasons. Rather than tax property or heads, it adopted what became seven. So that each colony may assess or lay such imposts or duties as it thinks proper. No federal impost was ever implemented, and states were unable to assess. The value of property or imposable tax or impost. Relying instead on a combination. Paper money and terror. Apportionment was the device for preventing a national tax on the population, while instead favoring one on foreigners. As Einhorn noted, Congress could levy the impost without talking about slavery. The nationalists gained momentum once they got to Philadelphia. The power to tax was extended to Congress. Which reads, the power to lay and collect taxes, duties, posts, and excises. To pay the debts. It is further limited by forbidding to Congress. It is no capitation or other direct tax shall be laid unless in proportion to the census or enumeration. These clauses.
I came from Canada right now at the door.
Oh, I see. These clauses transfer the power to tax exclusively. Transfer the power to tax exclusively from the states to the Congress. Over the next century, a system of dual jurisdiction jurisdiction over taxation emerged. Emerged in each state and local government. Tax houses and land. While the federal government was effectively limited. Imposts on specific imports rather than all imports. It's a freaking During the debate over whether to allow Congress to impose taxes on land and people, the disagreement over whether to count slaves as people or literally as an equivalent of non-human farm animals was resolved by the infamous compromise. In exchange for a direct tax on people rather than property, the slave states were obligated to accept poll taxes that included their slaves, but only by counting them as the notorious 3/5 of all other persons, 1.2.3 other persons serving as a weasel word for slave. The infamous 3/5 clause in the Constitution originated in Congress's 1783 request that the states approve an amendment to the Articles reading, "The whole number of white and other free citizens and inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition, including those bound to servitude for a term of years, and 3/5 of all other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description, except Indians not paying taxes in each state." The 3/5 clause was hardly a compromise, as historians tend to call it, since it favored only one side. As historian Robin Einhorn explains, at the very moment of its birth, the United States was already almost half slave and half free. The big slave states inflated their political representation by counting 3/5 of their slaves, and only temporary direct taxes on ever implemented for the next 74 years. Because no taxes were ever imposed on slaves, the slavocracy got the better end of the deal, receiving more federal revenue, possessing the same number of Senate seats regardless of population, adding seats in the House, and exaggerating their electoral college votes. The tariff became the only form of taxation because it allowed the Confederation Congress and later the Federal Congress to entirely avoid the issue of taxing slaves and all other forms of wealth and income. Since it wasn't apportioned based on population or value assessments, but instead imposed on imports, it entirely bypassed the need to count slaves. This was a considerable issue, as we saw earlier, primarily because only about 4% of the population in northern states were slaves, while 37% of the population in southern states were slaves. The tax debate had been about whether to count the number or the value of slaves. In the end, it did neither. According to historian David Waldstreicher, in the new American order, taxation with representation and slavery were joined at the hip. Okay. During the debate over whether to allow Congress to impose taxes on land and people, the disagreement over whether or literally as an equivalent. None. Was resolved by the infamous compromise. In exchange for a direct tax on people, in exchange for a direct tax on people rather than property, the slave states were obligated to accept poll taxes that included their slaves, but only by counting them as the notorious three-fifths clause, 3/5 of all other persons. One point 2.3 other persons it's a weasel word for a slave. infamous 3/5 clause in the Constitution originated in Congress's 1783 request that the states approve an amendment to the Articles reading the whole number of white and other free citizens, inhabitants of every age, sex, and condition, bound servitude for a term of years, and 3/5 of all other persons. 3/5 of all other persons not comprehended in the foregoing description. Except Indians not paying taxes in each state. The 3/5 clause was hardly a compromise. I tend to call it since it favored only one side. Explains at the very moment of its birth, the United States was already almost half slave and half free. The big slave states inflated their political representation. By counting 3/5 of their slaves, and only temporary direct taxes. Were ever implemented for the next 74 years. Because no taxes were ever imposed on slaves, the slaveocracy got the better end of the deal. Receiving more federal revenue. Receiving federal revenue. Receiving more federal revenue, possessing the same number of Senate seats regardless of population. Adding seats in the House, exaggerating their electoral college votes. The tariff became the only form of taxation. The tariff became the only form of taxation because it allowed the Confederation Congress and later the Federal Congress to entirely avoid the issue of taxing slaves and all other forms of wealth. Slaves and all other forms of wealth and income. Since it wasn't apportioned based on population or value, since it wasn't based on population or value assessments, but instead imposed on imports, but entirely bypassed. They bypassed the need to count slaves. The need to count slaves. This was a considerable issue, as we saw earlier. This was a considerable issue, as we saw earlier. Primarily because only about 4% of the population in northern states 37% of the population. The tax debate had been about whether to count the number. Tax debate had been about whether to count the number or the value of slaves. In the end, it did neither. It did neither. According to historian Wald Reicher, in the New American Order, taxation with representation and slavery were joined at the hip. Land taxes, redistribution from below. Redistribution. Oh, battery's dying. Okay, that's good. I think I'm going to stop recording now.